Thank you all for coming. I'm really happy to talk with you about this project, and I'm super thankful that the department invited me. It's a pleasure to see a new town, a new campus to me, and meet some new people, and I hope it's a long friendship. So this project that I'm presenting is a new project for me. I wrote my dissertation on Aristotle, but when I graduated from my PhD program, Aristotle and I fully broke up. And I had to go work on Plato for a while to recover. And I've only just in the last year started looking at Aristotle again. I mean, it's been 10 years or something since I got my PhD. So I'm fresh back at it. And I mean, you'll see what's kind of motivating this project, but it connects with a project that I'm doing on Plato that pertains to Plato's political economy, or his theory of how an economy will function in an ideal city. So what I'm going to be talking about today will intersect with that, because ultimately, spoiler alert, I'm going to make the case that Aristotle's conception of, this idea of politicality connects with economic activity in a really central way. I'm going to make the case, but maybe I won't persuade you guys. So the starting point for this inquiry is a passage that will probably be familiar to many, even if you haven't read much Aristotle. And it's this passage right here, this passage in Politics 1:2, Book 1, Chapter 2, where Aristotle says that man is by nature a political animal. Have you guys heard this saying before? It's kind of familiar, yeah? So I've given you the Greek too, which it really doesn't matter. I'm not even going to refer to the Greek, but you can see it there. This proposition, this sentence, is incredibly famous in Aristotle's work. In fact, it might be one of the most famous things that he wrote. But for all that, there is a lot of debate and disagreement about what is going on in this sentence. And here's what the debate is about. It's about what the relationship is supposed to be between this word man, which is in the subject position in the sentence, and being a political animal, or politicality, which is in the predicate position in the proposition. So we have a basic claim that takes the shape of the apple is red, or something like that. The man is a political animal. And the question is, what's the relationship? What does the is mean that's connecting these two things? Let me make this a little more vivid. Aristotle himself was obsessed with examining propositions that have this basic shape. He wrote a couple of treatises that are about this in particular. So anytime he constructs a sentence that has an is structure like this, he's being very careful. Let me give you a few examples that might help motivate the puzzle. So we can take a subject. I like triangles. We'll talk about triangles. We'll take a subject, triangle, and we'll predicate a few different things of triangle. We can say that a triangle is a three-sided enclosed figure with internal angles adding up to 180 degrees. Yeah, that's one proposition. We could also say the triangle is red. And we could also say the triangle is a shape. Yeah? Now, all of these propositions are saying something about triangle or triangles, but they're saying very different types of things about triangles. So the first proposition is specifying the definition of triangle, right? The essence or the what it is of a triangle just is three-sided enclosed figure with internal angles adding up to 180 degrees. The second proposition, the triangle is blue. Did I say red? The triangle is red, yeah? The triangle is red is definitely not specifying the definition of triangle. Can we all agree? It is in no way necessary or essential to a triangle or to the idea of triangle that it be red. So we say, well, that's a proposition that has a subject and a predicate, but it's an incidental predication. It's not a definitional or essential predication. And then the third proposition was the triangle is a shape. Now, this one's interesting because it's not merely incidental to triangles that they're shapes. Every triangle is a shape. but squares are shapes too, and so are circles, and so are whatever the shapes are, right? The shape is generic. It's a genus that, or a kind of thing that triangle belongs to, but it doesn't uniquely pick out triangle in the world, and so it can't count as the definition, right? So these are among the kinds of things that Aristotle differentiates when he's talking about these interesting propositional structures and the way that is can bring a subject and a predicate together in different ways, right? He thinks a lot of stuff can happen with an is. So the question is, what kind of is this is? Yeah? In what way does being a political animal belong to human being as a predicate to subject? Yeah? Okay, we get the question. Now, the most common answer is that it's definitional, that it's essential, that human beings are essentially political animals. And I've kind of spelled this out in literal terms for you. The Greek word for city is polis, and that just is the root of the word political. And so some of these Aristotle scholars go all in on saying what he means is literally human beings in their essence live in cities. He's super literal about what it means for man to be a political animal, yeah? Now there's a massive problem for these kinds of readings, and the problem is that Aristotle recognizes other species as political. Simple enough, yeah? So here, just a couple of lines after the man is by nature a political animal claim in the Politics, he says, the reason why man is a political animal in a higher degree than bees or other gregarious animals is evident. Nature, according to our theory, makes nothing in vain, and man alone of the animals is furnished with the faculty of language. Okay, there's a whole lot that's going on in this passage, so I'll highlight what's relevant. First of all, there are two things that are being implied about politicality. By the way, I really like this screen. This is super helpful for me. There are two things that are being implied about politicality in this passage. One thing that's being implied is that politicality exists on a spectrum, right? You can be political to a higher degree or a lesser degree, and that's kind of interesting on its own. It's not a binary condition where you are political or you're apolitical. You can be more or less political. Kind of curious. The second thing that's being implied, and this is crucial, is that he seems to be saying that there are other species, namely bees, but also these other gregarious animals that exist on that continuum, yeah? To a lesser degree than man. So it's possible that man or human being, whatever, is at the kind of farthest extreme of politicality, but the implication of this passage is that bees are somewhere lower on the same spectrum. So they count as political even if they count as less political, right? And then whatever the other gregarious animals are, I'll talk about it, but that's indicated here too. So what's interesting is that this passage seems to indicate that all of those scholars who want to say that that proposition is one that specifies definition, this seems like it just ruins their interpretation, right? And you might wonder, oh, did they just stop reading? Did they not read a couple of lines later? This comes from the same book and chapter where that other claim is made. What's going on? There's something very interesting that these scholars like to do. I've given you the Greek word here. Malon is being translated as in a higher degree than. What scholars have that take that reading have preferred to do here is read that malon as not meaning comparatively more than or in a higher degree than. They read it as rather than. Yeah? So that would read, the reason why man is a political animal the reason why man is a political animal rather than bees or other gregarious animals is evident. And then they look to the bottom of this passage, the end of it, and they say, look, he's specifying that the faculty of speech, the faculty of language translated here, is what that's part of what it is to be political. And he says, man alone has the faculty of speech. So clearly he means that man alone is political. And so when he said man is by nature a political animal, he means that uniquely picks out human beings in the world, and man is defined as being political. Okay, I mean, it's an interpretation. It's a very popular interpretation. I know, I think I've come across, countably many naysayers to this. I'm definitely a naysayer. But it does depend on how you want to render that comparative notion, right? The higher degree than or the more than. Is it supposed to be a rather than? That is possible within the meaning of this word in Greek. So it could be a way to go. But it's worth pointing out that within the politics, just a little further on, so I'm looking at book 1, chapter 8 here. We're in the same book, but we're a few chapters later. We see Aristotle making a lot of how human beings kind of fit within the animal kingdom. He says, of beasts, some are gregarious, we see that word again. Others are solitary. They live in the way which is best adapted to sustain them, accordingly as they are carnivorous or herbivorous or omnivorous. What is true of animals is also true of man. I take this as a strong signal from Aristotle that what he means to be doing in the politics is build a political theory on the foundation of his biology. That is, he is theorizing in the political space from certain priors, certain beliefs that he has about what human beings are as animals, as biological entities. I use the word zoological because it's kind of cuter. But the point is, we learn the foundations of Aristotle's political concepts by going to his biological works, and that informs his whole political project. Now, this mission to kind of recover the biological foundations of Aristotle's both ethical and political projects is something that a few people have been interested in, but most Aristotle scholars just kind of restrict themselves to one, maybe as hedgehogs, they restrict themselves to kind of just the normative parts of his corpus, his work. So they just look at the ethics or the politics, and they never go and read the biological works. But today I'm going to force you, along with me, to look at some of his biological works, okay? So the first step is to turn to we're going to look at one of Aristotle's biological texts. It's called The History of Animals. And I'm going to show you right here what I'm calling a zoological taxonomy. The zoological taxonomy is a taxonomy or a conceptual organization of, it includes this politicality concept, but it's an organization of how he thinks of animals kind of living together or living apart from each other in their co-species. So this passage comes from book 1, chapter 1 of Historia Animalium. There are 9 books in this text. It's quite long. And the last one is basically only about bees. I'm going to read you a couple of very cool passages from the bees thing. Here in the beginning, he's putting a lot of concepts on the table. And in this passage, he presents a handful of concepts that are really helpful for getting some traction on this question about what politicality is. So he says here, the following differences are manifest in the modes of living and actions of animals. Some are gregarious and some are solitary, whether they be furnished with feet or wings or be fitted for a life in the water. And some partake of both characters. And of the gregarious, some of these are political and others are scattered. So we see a couple of oppositions here. Well, I think we see, maybe I should go through this carefully. First of all, what he's observing are the modes of living and the actions of the animals. Yeah, so we should be attentive to the fact that he doesn't seem to be sorting animals according to their kinds. We often think of politicality as kind, but really he's talking about traits that belong to animals. And these traits could belong to one and the same trait could belong to very different kinds of animals. Okay, so that's the first thing to note. But second, he has these 4 concepts that are kind of set as contraries to one another that are doing a lot of work for him. So one set of contraries is the gregarious and the solitary. The gregarious animals are basically, you can think of these as the herding animals. Biologists today use the word gregarious, and the root of the word gregarious is the same one that we get in congregation, right? So this grouping or this herding. Yeah, so gregarious animals herd. Think of any herding animal that you want. That can be your staple herding animal. And then the solitary animals do the contrary of that. Yeah? What are those? I don't know. At one point he says that any predator bird or any bird with talons or something like that has to be solitary. So I guess he would say eagles and hawks and stuff. That makes sense to me. That works for me. Falcons. The other contraries are the political and the scattered. Those look like they might be the same as gregarious and solitary, but he says that the political and the scattered are like 2 different ways of being gregarious. Yeah, so you can be a herding animal and you can be political, or you can be scattered. Which is kind of interesting. I don't know. You might think here of the way that man lives in cities, because that's kind of an easy example. And then you can think of the way that like wolves or something, like do they hunt in packs? Do they? Yeah, they kind of like pair and stuff, right? Okay, whatever. I don't know if he talks about wolves, but let that be your example for the scattered. Okay, so we have all these concepts on the table. But it's the politicality in particular that we're interested in determining, how to answer this question about how politicality belongs to man. So he does take this up in the next line. He says that political animals are such as, and I've underlined what I take to be definitional here, political animals are such as have some one function common to all. I'm being very literal in translating the Greek there, so it sounds a little bit awkward. But they have some single function, whatever a function is, that is common to all. I think that means like the whole species. And this property of having a shared function or this common function is not common to all creatures that are gregarious. Which makes sense because we've just learned that some of the gregarious animals are scattered. They're not political. Yeah? Okay. But the political animals, those creatures are they're man, the bee, the wasp, the ant, and the crane. 5 species are named here. I take it that he means to be exhaustive. That is, he thinks that these are the only political animals. Yeah, that sounds like a crazy claim. Like, why even interpret him that way? The reason why I wanted to go out on a limb and say he really means to be exhaustive is because this man looked at the world so obsessively and documented it so obsessively. He actually managed to catalog over 500 species, which is really awesome, right? And like weird. But he had a way of thinking about how 500 different kinds of living things differed from one another. And I think that once you have a list that big and you're like really thinking hard about how to differentiate 500, could you guys do that? I'm just wondering, like, do you think you'd be able to like demarcate all? I don't think I could. It's really impressive. But once you've done that and then you come up with this list, I'm willing to conclude that he really thought about them all. He really thought about it. And he thought, this is it. This is the final list. Politicality is rare. We find it amongst 3 types of beings. These are the ones. Now, I don't know what to say about cranes. I think that we can look at this list and we can say, sure, man's political. Yes, we'll grant that bees are political, depending on what politicality is. And wasps, they're basically bees, so yes, we'll grant that. And then ants, I don't know, they're kind of like bees that don't fly. So yes, we'll grant the ants. But then you get to cranes and you think, well, why, right? And I don't have any satisfying answer. If you want to talk about that in the Q&A, we can talk about cranes. I'm always game for talking about the cranes. But this is his list. So this is what we're working with. And from here, we want to build a conception of what politicality is. So he next says, and I think this is a little bit helpful. He says, of these political creatures, some submit to a ruler, others are subject to no governance. As for instance, the crane and the several sorts of bee submit to a ruler, which is true. Whereas ants and numerous other creatures are everyone his own master. He didn't quite get that right. He didn't know about the ant situation. But what's interesting about this is that it doesn't reveal anything about the world, but it reveals something about the way he's thinking about politicality. He thinks that politicality is something completely disjoint from government, right? You can have politicality without any kind of ruler. You can have politicality when everyone is his own master, right? So politicality is not about some kind of government or state infrastructure existing in your community. It's something independent of anything like that. That's what makes this an interesting passage. So wherever we go looking for politicality, we can't look to a kind of governing structure to find it. Okay, so going back to the definitional account, what is this shared function that he says is what being political consists in? What does it mean for a species to have a shared function? I think that there's a range of ways that you could try to answer this kind of question. One way is to say that maybe it's to do with reciprocity. That, I think, captures the idea of something being shared, right? Like exchanging something. So maybe you and I could be in a political relationship with one another if we like reciprocate our, sorry, I'm like kind of picking you out, but we reciprocate in like doing, I don't know, some kind of work for each other or something like that. Or maybe it's about having a common goal. This idea of a goal, us being working in concert towards the same end, gets at that idea of the function, right? And maybe it's possible that politicality is merely very intensified herdishness, right? It's like being scattered is the low end of being herding, and then being political is just the high end of being herding. So that we shouldn't think of politicality as kind of different in kind in any sense. It's just a different degree of intensity along a continuum of gregariousness. Now, I think that all of these interpretations are wrong. And the reason why has to do with some passages in Aristotle. I'll have you look at these right away. But where he points to animals that he counts as gregarious, but do not appear in what I have counted as the exhaustive list of political animals. And these examples that I'm about to show you are examples of reciprocity and a common goal and doing all of these kinds of things, but they don't amount to politicality, right? So let's look at these examples. Here's one from Book 6 of the History of Animals. He says, the male pigeon takes its turn of sitting during the daytime. The sitting here is sitting like on the nest. Apparently this is true, by the way, in case you wanted to know. So the male pigeons actually do take their turn of sitting on the nest during the daytime, and the female sits during the night. Now there's a kind of reciprocity or sharing of this task that's important for getting offspring going for the species, but pigeons are definitely not counted amongst the political animals. He also says, this is in the context of pointing out that birds do not take care of their young once they're hatched. He says the crow is an exception. Apparently this is also true, in case you're interested. This bird, for a considerable time, takes charge of her young. For even when her young can fly, she flies alongside of them and supplies them with food. The male bird supports the female, which is very nice. Bringing her food and feeding her. That's very nice. So again, we have this common goal, right? And there's a kind of sharing of work or working in concert to the realization of that goal. But crows don't count as political animals. They're gregarious. They're merely gregarious. And last, each stallion has assigned to him about 30 mares, or even somewhat more. When a strange stallion approaches, He huddles his mares into a close ring, and he runs around them, and then he advances to the encounter of the newcomer. Okay, so we see this activity that indicates that this species, they work together, or they're herding, and there seems to be a kind of like design in the way that they're engaging in their activities. These horses are not counted as political. So we have these examples of different activities that don't constitute politicality. What it means to have a shared function must be something distinct from mere reciprocity or having a common goal. So here's my proposal. My proposal is that being a political animal is a matter of cooperating specifically to secure the material necessities of life. I'm being very specific about that, and this is gonna, it can get me into trouble with Aristotle folks, but I'll try to make my case. But this is the idea, that what a species is doing when they're doing their political thing is they are cooperating in producing what they need to consume in order to survive. Yeah? I have a few passages that help this, including the bee passages. But here's the first one. The first one comes from book 8 of the Historia Animalium. I'll have to explain a lot about this, but he says that habits and ways of life vary, like amongst the species, according to character and nutritional needs. So this habits and ways of life, but particularly the ways of life, connects back to the passage where he had said that species differ in their modes of life and their actions, right? So this seems like it's continuing that thought in a way. But the idea that the habits, praxis, actually just means actions. It actually is a repetition of the earlier passage. So these actions and these ways of life, the variance between species and what their actions and ways of life are, is explained by looking at something in the species that's more basic than their way of life and their actions. What's more basic is these two things: the species' character and their nutritional needs. Now, I think that nutritional needs makes enough sense, right? What an organism needs to eat can explain why it lives where it lives. Yeah, it can explain, we now know after Darwin, it can explain like why it has sharp teeth instead of flat teeth, right? He didn't know that. But the character point here is a little bit richer, I think. What does it mean for animals to have character? I think that what's going on here is that Aristotle thinks that different animals have different capacities, right? And here, by capacity, I really mean like psychic capacities, or you might think of perception as a capacity, and reasoning as a capacity, the ability to smell something 20 miles away is a capacity. All of these capacities, I think, are for Aristotle constitutive of the character of a species. And they are different from the nutritional needs of the species, though nutritional needs are going to be partly determined by the capacities that a species has. But these things combined, the set of capacities and the nutritional needs, combine to determine for a species what way of life is best for it. Yeah? Living in water and close to krill is best for whales, right? Because of the whale's capacities and its nutritional needs. But we could tell a story like that for every single species. What this is saying, I think, is that we can find the explanation for the way that life is organized for a given species by looking to what it needs materially. And that's why I understand politicality as really being about cooperating to secure the material needs of the species. Yeah, I'll try to continue making this case. Okay, here's a nice video for you while I read to you about bees. Okay, he says some things about bees that, he says a lot of things about bees. He was really obsessed with bees. But he says some things about bees that help support my claim that what's definitive of these political animals, or definitive of their politicality, is the way that they do work to secure their material needs. Here's what he says about bees. Amongst the many things that he says about bees, here's a couple of the things he says about bees. He says, separate detachments of bees are sent off for diverse operations. That is, some carry flower produce, and others carry water. Others smooth and arrange the combs. Some make wax. Some make honey. Some make bee bread, which I don't know what that is. And some shape and mold combs. Some bring water to the cells and mingle it with the honey. Some engage in out-of-door work. Second passage. They expel from the hive all idlers and unthrifts. I'm not sure what that word means. They destroy also the combs of the drones if a failure in the supply be threatening and the hive runs short of provisions. Under such circumstances, they fight desperately with all who try to take their honey, and they eject from the hive all the resident drones. So the bee life, the bee way of life, according to these passages, seems to be defined by the work that members of the hive, that is their community, the work that the members of the hive have to do to secure the material provisions of the hive, right? That's what they're doing. And I think that a similar story could be told about wasps. He does mention wasps in some of these passages where he's talking about bees, and he says, wasps kind of do the same thing. Ants, he says less about ants, but ants are really doing the same kind of stuff. And then, of course, I don't know what to say about cranes. But I think that his description of the bees, his account of them, what he's attending to and what he thinks worthwhile to describe, and so from that, what is informing his conception of bees as political, right? It all points back to this securing of the provisions story, yeah? I don't have any reason to think so far that it should be different in the human case. Aristotle, who was so obsessively systematic about concepts, says of man and of bees that they are political. So the same generic concept should carry over in describing each. Here's a passage from the Politics where he seems to point to exactly this idea. So we're talking about human beings here. He says, the state originates in the bare needs of life, and it continues in existence for the sake of a good life. Yeah. The bare needs of life can be nothing other than the material needs of life. Yeah? And the state here, what's translated as state, I think David will check, I'm sure, it's probably polis.
I was thinking so. I was looking for that passage too. So.
Probably is. Probably. Okay, but in any case, I think that we see when Aristotle is defining the state that he does think that what the polis is an organization for securing these material needs that we need. And what it means for the state or the polis to continue in existence for the sake of a good life is to say that this kind of organization of the community can become kind of sufficiently complex and sophisticated that it can elevate us above mere subsistence, right? It can liberate us from having to rely overly much on just laboring to feed ourselves. But we can start to do mathematics, and we can do philosophy, and we can make beautiful pottery and put on theater productions and live what he would call the good life. But it all starts, right, with the political community doing the work of securing the material needs. So, just to be very clear, political here is an ecological designation. When we're talking about the zoological concept, we can say that Aristotle has, amongst all the disciplines that he invented, probably invented ecology. He's very attentive to the way that animals extract resources from their environment, manipulate those resources to make honey in some cases, right? But feed themselves and allow for the continuance of their species through that ecological process. And he sees, I mean, if I'm right, that the notion of politicality is itself an ecological notion. It's not some, ethical or what we would call today a political notion, but it's a zoological concept or a biological concept. Then we find ourselves seeing, I think, much more clearly what those zoological or biological foundations are to his political theorizing. So this is the generic conception, right? That the kind political or the trait politicality is itself an ecological designation. In the case of human beings, I want to say, this amounts to economics. Because what we're doing ecologically, right, is that activity is the activity that we often will call economic activity. It's the activity of production. It's the activity of exchange, right? We have a very sophisticated way of securing our material needs, which is through the system of exchange. So when we turn to the special species that is human beings, we can think about economics rather than just ecology. But it fits in that family. At least I think that's what is going on with Aristotle. Now, a good reason to think that this is what he's up to is that his teacher, Plato, was very observant. He didn't spend a lot of time writing about it, but he was very observant of economic activity in his Athens. So Aristotle in the Republic, who here has read the Republic? Or some parts of the Republic? Yes, very good. So in a part of the Republic that no one pays attention to, book 2, Socrates describes this early city that is just, the only thing that's said about this city is like its economic organization. Yeah, all it's doing, all the people in it are doing is just producing stuff and trading it. And this is where Socrates presents the idea that everyone in the ideal city, he's going to go on to make the case, everyone in the ideal city will specialize in their work. And when they specialize in their work, they're going to have to trade the surplus production of their work. Because imagine that you are baking bread, yeah, and you find yourself in your bakery with lots of bread to eat, but no shoes, yeah, and even worse, no wine, yeah. So you want to come over here to the winemaker, yeah, who doesn't have any bread, not on her own, right? And you want to trade. So Socrates says, in order for a city to be ideal, we need everyone to be kind of maximally expert in their production, so they can maximize their production and they can make really good versions of their products. But if we're doing that, then we have to have some kind of system of exchange where the winemaker and the bread maker can share their products so that you can survive in this division of labor, right? So Plato had observed this and he took it to be the foundation of his ideal city, right? You have this producer class. It's the biggest class in his ideal city. Everyone is specialized in it, and they are just engaged in very complex, massive trade. He says when he's describing this early city that there will be a marketplace, there will be a currency that they use. They use some kind of money, right? There will be people who even specialize in sitting at the marketplace as retail traders. And the reason why is so that you can go back to making your wine after you've dropped your product off at the market, right? So that you don't have to sit in the stall waiting for someone to come buy your wine. You can get right back to making the wine, right? So you have retail trade specialists, right? Everyone is specialized in this environment so that we can maximize the quantity and the quality of goods produced so that we can get past our basic needs and kind of achieve that good life, right? It's on this foundation that Plato reaches the point where he can say, and we can have philosopher kings too, right? Our surplus production will be great enough we can afford to feed a troop of warriors and a philosopher king, yeah? Okay, so Aristotle learned this at Plato's knee. Okay, so then the idea is, or I guess the question is, does Aristotle, in thinking about politicality as being this ecological notion and, on my argument, an economic notion for the human species, does he mean to be saying that that description of economic activity, the one that Plato had provided, that is kind of the activity that is natural to us? Remember, man is by nature a political animal. Is all of that something that we're supposed to do in the course of expressing our nature? We're supposed to be in this kind of economic organization. And I think no. So my former teacher, after he passed, actually, I discovered a paper that he wrote where he briefly engages with something like this. He proposes that what politicality is for Aristotle is a matter of a role-differentiated division of labor. Yeah, which is very close to what I am arguing here. But I think that this is not Aristotle's view. I think that Cooper was wrong here. And it's to do with this kind of claim that we see in the Politics. Aristotle says the same persons, for example, may serve as soldiers, farmers, and craftsmen. The same persons again, so those same persons, may act both as deliberative council and a judicial court. Political ability, too, is a quality which all men pretend to which all men pretend. The word for pretend is kind of tricky there. And everyone thinks himself capable of filling most offices. There's only one thing that's impossible, that the same persons be both rich and poor. You can't have the same persons be both rich and poor. But the same persons can be all these other things. Yeah? So it's consistent with Aristotle's view. In fact, I think it might be consistent with his recommendation that you have people who are not so specialized in their roles in the city, that they're only making wine or they're only making bread. But you have people who maybe engage in some kind of production. In fact, I think he probably wants everybody to be like a farmer and a legislator or something. That's his vision. But you have these people who are engaged in the what we call political activities of directing the state through legislation and through court decisions. Those same people are engaged in other roles that are important to meeting the needs, the material needs of the city. So I don't think it's right to say that what Aristotle conceives of politicality as being just is the role differentiation. Though, it's a sympathetic view because we see amongst bees a kind of perfect role differentiation, right? The queen is not a worker, and the worker is not a drone, right? So amongst the other species, we see a kind of role differentiation that recommends thinking about politicality as consisting in a role differentiated or a division of labor that is governed by the principle of specialization, right? A hyper-specialized division of labor. But when we turn to the case of human beings, I think that Aristotle does not agree with that. He doesn't think that that kind of specialization is to the good. He says the state is made up only of so many men, but of different kinds of men, for similars do not constitute a state. Now, this passage could be read either way. So Cooper could take it as evidence for his view about difference amounting to role differentiation. I can read it as in another way. But I want to point to this because I am laying so much emphasis on a kind of diversity and cooperation amongst diversity, even though without strict specialization, that it invites criticism, or it at least invites me to engage with another reading of politicality, which comes from this guy named Stephen Scoltetti, whose work on Aristotle's Politics is amazing. So Scoltetti takes the view that what being political amounts to for Aristotle is a matter of being able to kind of contend in these political spheres, right? It's to engage in rivalry and competition with your fellows. What Skoltedi thinks is that we achieve the good of politics, that is living together in the best way possible, right? Achieving the human flourishing through winning that goal through competition. Yeah, it's a very interesting reading. It has a lot to be said for it. But I think the problem here is that Aristotle places so much emphasis on cooperation when he's talking about the shared, I think it's baked into the concept of the shared function, that I think that we should peel off the instrumental value of being in conflict and rivalry and competition from what the politicality itself is. Yeah? So difference and disagreement and competition amongst rivals, even competition amongst rival potters, if you know your Hesiod, probably don't, it's a weird passage. That kind of rivalry can be to the good of kind of getting better pots, right? If the potter's competing with the potter for the consumer's attention and money. But that rivalry itself is not definitive of the politicality. It's the cooperation, it's all of us at the kind of macro level being capable of producing all the things that we actually need that amounts to the politicality. And also, for what it's worth, Skoltedi is definitely not reading the biological work. So he's in the camp of like, I'm just going to read the politics and the ethics, and I don't even know what the names of the biological works are, which is very normal. But he's not trying to make a case about the biological foundation of the political theory being something to do with conflict. He's just looking at the political itself, and he's saying that conflict is requisite for making the political count as political. I think that's wrong. I think if we look to the biological treatises, we find cooperation, not conflict, as the root. So here's a passage that I think helps me on this. Aristotle says, friendship we believe to be the greatest good of states and the preservative of them against revolutions. So I think here specifying that the good is to do with cooperation and conciliatory attitudes indicates that, you know, conflict is not the good of states, right? Conflict is not the thing that helps us achieve the common goal. It's the cooperation and the mutual love and the fellow feeling. Okay, briefly, what destroys the shared function? Now here's where we kind of get into the guts of thinking about how Aristotle thinks about economics. Aristotle thinks that there is a way of destroying the shared function within the economic sphere. And this is where I think we start to really see him engaging with his teacher's vision of a very complex, super specialized division of labor. Okay, here's one thing he says. They're intent upon, these are the bad guys. The bad guys are intent upon living only and not upon living well. And as their desires are unlimited, they also desire that the means of gratifying them should be without limit. Some men turn every quality or art into a means of getting wealth. This they conceive to be the end, and to the promotion of the end, they think all things must contribute. So here, quite explicitly, Aristotle is criticizing people who take money or wealth to be an end. Yeah? He elsewhere says in the Nicomachean Ethics that to take money to be an end of life is to make a category mistake. Money is, by its very concept, a means to an end. It is never an end, right? It cannot be an end in itself. So here he's criticizing some men. I think he thinks a lot of people are like this. The people who take wealth getting, wealth accumulation to be what they're on this earth to do and to be, you know, constitutive of their good. He's criticizing them and he's saying, this is really bad, right? They're up to the wrong kind of thing. So they're doing something that really looks a lot like what those drones were doing in the beehive. Yeah, and if it starts to, we could think by analogy, just as the drones start to be kicked out of the hive when the other productive bees realize that like their rations and their provisions are getting low, Aristotle would probably recommend you really need to get rid of your wealth seekers, right? If it starts to look like the state is in trouble. And I really mean those basic needs, right? Going back to the basis of the politicality. If it looks like our basic needs are in trouble, we have to get rid of our drones. They're a problem. There's an interesting puzzle here, I think, in thinking about the problem of retail trade in particular. Now, I explained earlier that Plato had identified and recommended retail traders, right? There's a question in Aristotle about what his attitude towards these retail traders is. So he says here, giving and receiving wine, for example, in exchange for corn. Oh my gosh, that's the exact example that I used. No, I used bread and wine. It's like, this is really getting in my brain. Okay, sorry. So giving and receiving wine, for example, in exchange for corn is not part of the wealth-getting art and is not contrary to nature, but is needed for the satisfaction of men's natural wants. Okay, he's approving of this kind of exchange, right? He's saying this is not contrary to nature. This is needed. It's necessary for the meeting of the basic needs, the satisfaction of men's natural wants. But look at what he's describing here. He's describing trading wine for corn. This isn't a retail trader sitting in a stall trading your wine for money, right? And then taking that money and trading that for the bread. This is direct bartering between the two of you. So right here, he's definitely saying barter is cool, barter is necessary, it's good. It's not contrary to nature at a minimum, but it seems to be, you know, he abides his teacher's principle that exchange is to the good of securing what we need. But this isn't retail trade. Look at what he says here. The most hated sort, and with the greatest reason, is usury. So usury is giving a loan at interest, right? So I give you $100, but when you give it back to me in a month, you're going to give me $107. That's usury. So the most hated sort, and with the greatest reason, is usury, which makes a gain out of money itself and not from the natural object of money. Yeah, so don't confuse the means and the end, right? For money was intended to be used in exchange, but not to increase at interest. Okay, so the question here is, where would he put retail trade? On the one hand, he says bartering is natural and it helps us in the political project because we can satisfy our needs through exchange. Here he says this horrible, most hated kind of economic activity is the financial tool of interest-bearing loans, right? So my question is, what does he think is going on with a retail trader? Yeah, so a retail trader, in order to make their own living as a specialist, needs to be marking up products when they turn it over, right? You bring the wine, I'm the middleman, I give you $10 for your case of wine, but I sell it for $12, right? And the $2 difference is what I get to take home. That's what I've made from my specialization. But Aristotle, I don't know if Aristotle is just insensitive to this. I don't know if he just was less observant than his teacher, and so he didn't actually understand or see that there are these sophisticated things in the economy, things like retail trade, that require that marking up, right? I don't know if he would think of usury or giving loans at interest as being comparable to or the same as that marking up. But I have a question here about what Aristotle thinks the natural ecological mode is for human beings. What does he think is permissible? I think, I'll just close, I'll close with one remark. I think that this is really interesting. I think that, I wouldn't invite you all to start thinking about this problem with me necessarily, but I will point to the fact that there are a lot of people in this country right now who are starting to say things like, we should get rid of usury, we should get rid of interest-bearing loans, and we should kind of contract some of our economic activity. And a lot of them actually are influenced by Aristotelian natural law kinds of arguments. I think it's kind of interesting to look at Aristotle and try to recover what his economic thought is that's kind of being translated into this modern sphere and being leveraged for these political arguments. I don't know that Aristotle has a clear conception of what is going on in the economy. Yeah. But he definitely has a conception of there being a natural kind of limit or boundary of activity. On one side of that boundary is human flourishing, and on the far side of it is like the drones are taking over the hive kinds of problems. So somewhere in here, on my argument, in Aristotle's conception of politicality, is a limit of what our kind of flourishing ecological activity really looks like. But I'll close there. I just want to leave you with the final thought. I'll give you this cute video too. That really, don't believe anyone who tells you that, according to Aristotle, man is essentially political. This is a trait that we bear in a more or less way, and that we share with other animals. Yeah. Thank you.
So when you mentioned eudaimonia, like human flourishing, and how
Very good.
when Aristotle, he kind of like, I think you said that having that political community will allow human beings to focus on math and science and philosophy.
Yeah.
Does Aristotle recognize that even though we would have that political community, not everyone, or maybe not most people in that community would actually reach human flourishing because maybe economic inequalities or social inequalities? And
Yeah, this is an incredibly rich question. You've asked a really, really good and really challenging question. So one thing that I elided that might start towards an answer to your question, but one thing I elided is what Aristotle says in the Politics about there being what he would count as a kind of natural role differentiation within our species. And when I say that, I mean he says that there are these natural slaves, and that women are fundamentally different from men, and that children are something as well, though they get to grow up and kind of change and actualize. But he thinks that men and women and these natural slaves, right, are different in their nature in a way that informs like how they ought to be organized in relation to one another within the city, right? So importantly, a woman needs to be in a household with a man helping her, yeah, telling her what to do or whatever, managing her life. And the same with the natural slave. So I didn't talk about any of that. I kind of elided that and talked about the kind of role differentiation that we ordinarily think of as opted into, right? We choose to be a baker, we choose to be a winemaker, we choose to be a philosopher or whatever, unless you're in Plato's city and someone's choosing for you. But Aristotle, I think, thinks that we choose all those things for ourselves in his vision of the city. But underneath that choice, there are a whole bunch of people that he thinks are naturally put in a certain position or made to serve in a certain kind of role in society, right? There's no choice left to the woman to be a philosopher on his vision. Okay, so to connect this with your question, yeah, he definitely thinks that there are limits and there are boundaries on like who can achieve the human good, right? And a lot of that is determined by this first order role differentiation that he thinks nature imposes to do with distinguishing the slave from the woman from the man. But then there's also the second order role differentiation, where we opt into ways of life that are more or less conducive to achieving the best human good. And on his view, I mean, he's not uncertain about this at all. In the last book of the Nicomachean Ethics, he makes it very clear that there are only two kinds of life that count as happy. One is what he calls the political life, which is the life of like the statesman who has tons of money and is able to go around exercising courage and generosity and justice or whatever. The other life is the life of the philosopher who gets to look up at the sky and contemplate the cosmos. So within Aristotle's theory of human flourishing, to go to your question, he definitely thinks not everyone's going to achieve it. And then, connecting this with my talk, the reason why very few people will achieve it has to do with both the natural role differentiation and the chosen role differentiation of choosing which vocation or occupation you want to take up. Yeah, does that help in answering the question? It's a really good question. That's a long answer. But yeah, that's kind of peeling it back. So why didn't I talk about slaves and women and men, right? If this is a kind of role differentiation that's salient, well, I don't know. I don't have a really good question or a good answer for why I don't talk about that. Most of it is because I think when we're thinking about this ecological conception of the political, the analog for the bee is, you could think that the slave woman man is the analog for, the worker and the drone and the queen or whatever in the hive. You could think that that's the correct analog. But I think that what's going on with the story of the bees and the other political animals is a story about their productive activities. And I think that means that when we turn to the human case, maybe I ought to account for this natural role differentiation. But what matters at least as much is that what I'm calling the kind of second order chosen role differentiation as well, because that's where we do a lot of the productive activity. I'm kind of backing off of my own claims here, because it's clear that Aristotle thinks that slaves are like really important to the productive activities of his city, and that women are playing a very particular, crucial, productive role with the rearing of children and educating of children. So I don't know, now you have me just talking myself into needing to include it more, but yeah, am I answering your question? Okay, thank you. Any other student questions that want to make me change my whole view? Yeah.
I'm having a little bit of a hard time figuring out exactly how to word it.
Yeah.
Definitely the beginning in the first passage, my focus kind of immediately went to the word feces.
The word what?
Feces, nature.
Yes, good. Yes, one of my favorite concepts.
There's a distinction. I've been researching a little bit about personhood and the distinction between personhood and nature. And one of the things that came up was energeia, which is the concept of exactly what something does. And I feel like throughout...
That's when it's actualized, right? Like it's made able to do the thing that it's supposed to do,
something
right?
like that, yeah.
Okay.
And so I when I saw the word feces, I immediately wondered, okay, what if we're saying that being political is a part of what something is, then what part of what it is the political part? And then afterwards, the examples that were shown were examples of things being political, which I think would be more akin to the energeia of being political. And so I wonder, I guess my question is basically metaphysically, what part is the political part? And if we can't really put our finger on it, could it be the case that it's really an energeia?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess the way that I was conceiving of this was to think, when we're talking about being political, we're not talking about something that's in the what it is. So we're not meaning to specify either the definition or the kind of thing, but we're really meaning to specify some kind of trait that it will bear under certain conditions. This is where my answer to your question is going to lie, is that in certain very important conditions, man enjoys a mode of life that is political. Now, in those passages, Aristotle said, I didn't include this line from the History of Animals, but remember he said that some animals are gregarious and some are solitary and some partake of both. He actually includes man in both. He says that man can be political and solitary, which sounds kind of bananas, right? But here's what he says. I'm sorry I didn't go into this. There's just so much. He says in the Politics that there are these solitary human beings that are, we can find them amongst pirates. So pirates are living a solitary life. Even though they're living in a band, right? He counts them as solitary. And he says that the Cyclops, the Cyclopes, the Cyclops, like if you've read your Homer, you know, Polyphemus is the Cyclops that Odysseus pokes the eye out of. Those guys are living a solitary life. And he says, you know, these are examples of human beings that are partaking of this other mode of life, right? It's the non-political mode of life. And he points to them and he says, this is the evidence that that mode of life, right, is incompatible with human flourishing, to go back to the question that we had earlier. So there's the condition under which man is political is the condition of man flourishing. So to put that in like the terms that you're using, it's when man is actualizing his nature that he is in the political mode of life. And if man finds himself in the pirate band or whatever, or living amongst the Cyclops, he's in a mode of life that is not conducive to flourishing and is not actualizing his nature. So energeia as a concept a little bit eludes me, so apologies. But I think that when Aristotle's talking about energeia, you know, in his De Anima, his psychological text, and also in his metaphysics, he's often talking about that actualization of capacities. And that actualization is in activity, right? It's in the doing. But it's an actualization of the form or the capacities of the human being. So I think the story here is that we are political when we are actualizing, it's in the mode of life that is political that we have a shot at actualizing ourselves and like enjoying the energeia that is, you know, the complement to our dunamis, right? The dunamis is the potentiality and the energeia is the actualization of that potentiality. So that's my answer to it. It's not about determining what kind of thing it is, or politicality isn't in the what it is of a human being, but it is a condition that's requisite for the actualization of a human being. These are very, very closely related, obviously, but I think for Aristotle, observing the difference is important. I'm sorry if I sound muddled. Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm sorry I didn't talk about the pirates. Yeah, sorry.
Great. Other student questions?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Questions? Take it away, Jeff.
That was really fascinating talk. Thank you.
Thanks.
And my question comes right off the last two very good questions.
Yeah, I think those were very related, yeah.
Yeah, and so I had a puzzle, and maybe you just answered it, but I'm going to say it anyway. And I'm a fox about
Great.
Aristotle and Plato.
Yeah, good.
So yeah, the political mode of being is to cooperate to secure material necessities of life for you, and things like nutritional demands and so forth. And so then I was trying to square that with this idea of that philosophy and intellectual pursuits are the highest good of human flourishing. and was saying, well, does that mean that when we're doing those things, maybe we're helping to ultimately organize, solving math proofs so that we could organize society to get better nutrition ultimately.
Right.
But then I guess maybe the answer is they're just different modes of being.
Yeah.
Or are they? Like, does that other intellectual mode trace back to this political mode ultimately? If we're doing this ecological account?
I like that.
I'm going to try and answer, and this is influenced by like a couple decades long thinking about this question. I think this is a really good question. And at base, the question is, what is the relationship between the philosophical life and the political life? It's a really great question. And philosophers have been tackling this for a really long time. Here's what I think is Aristotle's answer. And I'll just put a caret on this. A lot of people disagree with me about this. So I take the view that Aristotle thinks that the philosophical life is to be distinguished from the political life, and that the philosophical life is something that we're able to enjoy kind of when the political problem is solved. What is the political problem? And the political problem, I think we can figure out what that problem is by looking at his account of the way that we solve it, right? We're going to do some reverse engineering here. But he thinks that the skills that we need in the political life, going to that last book of the Nicomachean Ethics again, the skills that we need to navigate the political life successfully, to make that a happy life, are the virtues. These are the character virtues. So, and how many does he enumerate? There's a disagreement about this, 12 or 11 or whatever. But they do include justice and generosity, courage. You know them all. Yeah, you probably have them all, right? So all of those things, plus practical wisdom, right, which isn't a character virtue, it's an intellectual virtue. But all of the character virtues plus practical wisdom, when you are exercising those in concert, you are able to navigate the political world and solve its problems, or probably better put, manage its problems. I don't think you can solve political problems, but you can manage its problems excellently. So those problems are problems of, what kind of problem does courage resolve? Deep conflicts about resources sometimes, or power. What kind of problem does generosity resolve? Problems about scarcity and want, right? What does justice resolve? It resolves conflicts in parties, between parties to exchange. What are the others? Temperance, right? This management of bodily pleasure, that manages the problem of like consuming correctly or something like that, right? I think that when you look to the skills and the traits that he thinks we need to succeed in that sphere, we find reinforcement of my picture, that the political life is the life of navigating and managing this material mess that we're in, that's generated by our material needs and our material scarcities and our propensity to want what our neighbor has, right? And the philosophical life is one that we get to enjoy when that's kind of sufficiently managed, that we have the what Cicero called otium, what Aristotle called scholium, to the or schole, the rest, the peace from those problems that enables us to liberate our minds and think about something beyond this, right? Look up at the sky. So I think that they're very different. And we get to philosophy through getting the mess under control, but it's really hard to flip this. And when you look at the ancient world, I think that you see some philosophers, like the Cynics, for example, proposing that we should not wait for philosophy, right? The Cynics are willing to live in the bathtub in the city and protest all of the norms of the city and just do the philosophy first, right? And it's like they think, well, we shouldn't wait to achieve that height of human possibility by just making sure that we're concerned with solving the political problem. We should run into the philosophical life. But there are these other philosophers, and I think Plato foremost amongst them, who look at our lives and they think, we really need to sort out the political problem first. And it could be that we really need a philosopher to come in and facilitate that. That puts us in a bind. We're in a real bind with that. But we're not going to be able to do really good philosophy if we don't secure all of this. Yeah. Is that a good answer?
Yeah, that helps.
I don't know. Yeah.
Other questions?
Yeah.
I just joined, so I
Hi.
don't really know the lecture.
You can just ask a question about something I just said.
I just looked at the description of
Mhm.
this talk, so then what's political is like based on like a shared function for like concerning animals, right? So then
Yeah.
I was wondering if that political aspect can be attributed to like non-animals, for example, like plants that have symbiosis with like ants, for example, or say like a virus that's able to infect like cells in order to create more of its virus
Yeah.
beings. So it kind of has like a shared function in a way. So, but that political aspect applied in those examples as well.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. One thing this connects with is it goes to another thing that I didn't really emphasize in my talk, and you weren't here anyway, so who cares? But there's this concept in modern biology of eusociality, right? Eusociality is a descriptor for species that engage in a kind of, I mean, we could call it a shared function. They have this kind of like massive cooperation. But eusocial animals in particular have this cooperation that's like intergenerational, right? Like they are caring for young in a way. They're like focused on the next generation. And also there's this very complex totality, even temporally, to their existence that makes them eusocial in this really expansive way. You can look at Aristotle's political animals and you can see some eusociality there. It could be that the right way to describe these species is to say they're eusocial because there's a kind of intergenerational care amongst all of them. And that's actually where cranes are interesting because they do that. But Aristotle himself did not have any concept of bacteria and viruses. And I don't know what he would say about this. In fact, I don't know what Aristotle would say about our conception of biology today after Darwin upset his whole framework of forms. He was really rendered obsolete by the emergence of the theory of evolution. But for all that, I think that if he were to see something common amongst these beings and the animals that he describes as political, I think, yeah, it would be, I think that he probably would see it in, here, I'll propose a really weird one. Slime molds. Slime molds are these really strange things that are definitely eusocial. They even engage in some kind of social learning, right? But yeah, if he knew about these things, I think he would see what is the same trait of politicality that I've described here in these strange animals. So yes, I think it's there. Plants, though, plants are very interesting. Aristotle's best friend was this guy named Theophrastus. And Theophrastus lived on the island of Lesbos. Aristotle went out there and they gallivanted around the island, studying animals and plants. And while Aristotle was writing multiple volumes of books about animals, Theophrastus was writing about plants. He like documented every species of plants on the island of Lesbos. I don't know to what extent Plato observed behavior in plants that he would find comparable to animals. I do know that he put them on a continuum of living creatures with animals. He thought that plants were just souls that lacked perceptual capabilities. I guess he didn't see the way that like some creepy plants like they like reach towards the sun and stuff, right? They seem sentient. But so I don't know what to say about plants. I'm not really sure how they would fit into his framework. But depending on where you put slime molds, I might have already answered the question. He would identify a trait, right? And if he saw a trait in a living creature, I think he'd be willing to include it amongst political beings. That's venturing on that answer, but yeah, that's what I'll say.
I think we better thank our speaker here.
Oh, thank you guys. This is so fun. Thank you. Thank you.